Hello, let's start with the first chapter in our textbook called Psychology is a Way of Thinking. This chapter will consist of 4 sections, and they will be split into PowerPoint presentations. The first part, 1.1, will consist of the first 2 sections, learning goals for this class, to which I will refer as research methods, because the official name is kind of long, Foundations of Psychological Research. And then we also will talk about research producers and research consumers. In the second half of this lecture, we'll talk about 3 scientific cycles and the research process. They will be split into 2 PowerPoint presentations to make sure that they're not overly long. Let's start with the first one, goals of a research methods course. Now, you need to understand these goals because that will help you to understand why we are going to do what we're going to do. Why do we have frequent quizzes? Why do we have assignments, assignment 1 and assignment 2? So our overarching goal for this class is to understand what psychology as a science is and how research in psychology is conducted, to investigate all kinds of phenomena in human behavior and thinking. We will also try to learn as much as possible about the APA style guides, and we will be using the 7th edition that came out in 2019. That will help us to write the 2 assignments that we will be engaged in for this course. Another important skill that I would like you to learn in this class is to be able to come up with an original research question that then you could implement in a small observational empirical study. And you would need to do it in a group of 3 students. Assignment number 1 will be dedicated to critically evaluating a presentation of a psychological empirical study as done by journalists in media. And media can be of various types. It could be a TV program, a blog, an article on the website, and so on. And then you will be able to compare the presentation created by journalists with the actual research study. And that's going to be assignment number 1. Finally, you will have your most important assignment, assignment number 2, in which you will investigate your research question using the psychological scientific method by posing a question, making predictions, deciding on the design of your study, going out and collecting data, and we'll have to think about how to do that, analyzing your data in a very simple way using descriptive statistics, and finally writing up the results as a research lab that you will submit at the end of the course. So more specifically, we will focus on the research process and the scientific method. The scientific method is the same one that we use in other STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, because psychology is a science. And the way we will do that is by trying to find some explanation for a particular human behavior. So we will try to come up with a research question that's testable empirically. Then we will have to figure out a design for the study. Like I said, most likely it's going to be an observation. Then once you collect your data, you will be able to analyze it and interpret by coming up with some patterns in your data, and then writing and presenting them in the APA style. Okay, let's move on to section 2 that has to do with the difference between the research production and the research consumption. So think about who research producers are. Usually research producers are research scientists, faculty, professors, and graduate students who are being trained to become research producers. In fact, many undergraduate students are also being trained to be research producers. The way it usually happens in a college setup is for you, students, to go and start working in the research lab. We have many research labs in our department, and whenever you see this little point on the slides called activity, that means I suggest that you pause listening to the lecture and do the research activities that are presented here on the slide. So in this case, I'm asking you to stop for a second and check out the research labs that we have at the Department of Psychology at the College of Staten Island. And we have several groups. We have developmental labs, we have cognitive psychology labs, one of them is mine. We have neuroscience labs, and we have social and personality psychology labs. All of the labs are headed by my colleagues at the Department of Psychology, and you should be able to find one that appeals to you the most. This is especially important for those of you who are considering perhaps graduating with honors from our department. To do that, you will need to write an honors thesis, which is usually conducted under the supervision of one of my colleagues. If you want to see what a research producer does in terms of publications, I suggest that you check out my website on ResearchGate. It's at the bottom of the slide, and you will see the kinds of work that I've been doing for the past 15 years. Okay. Okay, now let's move to comparing research producers to research consumers. Now, only a few of us are research producers, but all of us are research consumers. Now, what does a research consumer do? Well, a research consumer actually consumes research, right? Reads about the research the way it is presented in media, sometimes reads actual research articles, and uses this information to guide sometimes his or her decisions in everyday life. Now, what kinds of research sources that are available to us are scientific journals. Now, scientific journals are written for specialists, so not too many people who don't have specialized education are able to process and understand such articles. That's why we have popular magazines for which journalists who are trained to interpret research write popular articles. Then we can actually look at how the journalists present pieces of research to general public, because it often guides these people's decision in life. So think about something that's dear to my research program, bilingualism. Imagine that you are a parent in California or in Texas, where we have a lot of Hispanic speaking people. Now, if we have a child in our family, do we want our child to be educated only in English? Or should we think that being educated bilingually in Spanish and in English is a good thing? So research on bilingualism informs these kinds of decisions, not only for parents, but for school districts and in general educational approach in this country. Now, we can also get some information from TV shows, websites, blogs, etc. There are many, many sources of such information. What's critical to be an educated research consumer is to be able to interrogate these sources critically. The book gives us an interesting example that will allow you to understand why being an educated consumer is important. What I have in mind is a particular discussion on pages 7 and 8 that has to do with facilitated communication. Now, some of our students have been working with autistic children and know firsthand what it means to communicate with such children. So if we think about the early 1990s, there was an interesting development in the field of special education, in particular autism, that has to do with how one would communicate and talk to autistic children who are nonverbal. So this is known as a facilitated communication, where a trained facilitator would use, in those days, a special board. In these days, it's a computer or tablet, and would gently hold the patient's hand, like it is on this picture, which is figure 1.2 in chapter 1, and help the patient type in his or her message. Now, of course, the controversy behind facilitated communication had to do with the fact whether it was the actual patient who was communicating with the world, or whether there was inadvertent, perhaps, push from the facilitator. So if you are interested in learning more about it, so here is your new activity for this section of the slides, is to go to the Blackboard in weekly schedule number 2, right after this lecture, and watch a short excerpt from the video investigation done by Frontline in 1993, which was then presented as a documentary called Prisoners of Silence. Now, I ask you, as you watch it, to think, how would you try to figure out, as a psychologist, whether the message that a patient is communicating is actually his or her words and not the words of a facilitator? And that's an interesting way to think how we could actually interrogate a particular idea using the scientific method. Now, the book explains that it is important to do something like that, because imagine yourself working in a situation where you could actually take a training course in facilitated communication. Now, the course is expensive. Do you want to take it? Do you want to pay for it? And being able to look at the facilitated communication from the point of view of its controversy could actually save you a lot of money. Finally, on the same page in textbook, there is a little discussion about an experiment that was conducted by Elliot and his colleagues. And here is the reference to this article about the impact of color red on academic performance. Now, I suggest that you look at this article. It's posted for you on the Blackboard, and read the first 5 pages that describe experiment 1, from pages 154 to pages 158. In this article, Elliot and his colleagues show that using color red in very innocuous way, like giving participants a booklet that has a red cover, will actually impede their performance on the academic test. So being an educated research consumer is important in our everyday life, because it will help us explain our behavior.